Right. Well, welcome to this webinar on with a very provocative title, which has a very provocative title, Is the DRC a Lost Cause? I'm Nina Wilén. I'm the director of the Africa program at the Egmont Institute of International Relations, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. With me today, I have two people who have immense knowledge and experience from the DRC from different periods. And I'm going to introduce them in a little bit. I first just wanted to say that this is our second webinar in a week on the DRC at the Egmont Institute. So for those of you who missed last week's webinar, which was co-organized with EURAC on the elections in the DRC, where we had several participants from the CENI, you can watch that webinar again on the Egmont's YouTube channel after this one, of course. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the speakers today. I'm not going to go through all of their CVs because they are both very long, but I will give you some of the, let's say, the most relevant aspects of it for today's webinar. So first, I have Alan Doss, who has a diplomat with an impressive UN career in Africa in particular, in several peacekeeping missions in Sierra Leone, Côte d'Ivoire, Liberia, and most importantly for us today as a special representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations in the DRC for the UN Peacekeeping Mission, which at the time was called MONUC. After his career, Alan has been working, amongst other, as the president of the Kofi Annan Foundation, and now as its senior advisor, among other things. Alan is also a prolific author who has written several articles, chapters, and books. As the editor of International Peacekeeping, I would, of course, like to put forward his article in that journal, which is called Eyewitness, Crisis, Contention, and Coherence, Reflections from the Field. But there have been quite a few publications since that article came out, amongst other his book published with Renier publishers, and it's called A Peacekeeper in Africa, Learning from UN Interventions in Other People's Wars. Alan, I'm delighted to have you here today. I'm equally glad to introduce the discussant of today's webinar, Renier Nijskens, who also has an impressive diplomatic career in Africa, as the Belgian ambassador in Niger, Kenya, and relevant for today's webinar as the ambassador in Kinshasa. He has also served as a resident representative of the Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy in Africa. But perhaps most important for today's discussion is his last role within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as the Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region. So today we're going to discuss the situation in the DRC, which is currently facing challenging security and political contexts in addition to humanitarian disaster in certain areas of the country. We have a renewed armed conflict in the east of the DRC, linked to the revival of the rebel group M23, supported by the neighbor Rwanda again. We also have the deployment of a regional security force, the East African Regional Force, which is set to leave in a few weeks. And we also have the departure of the UN mission MINUSMA, which has been in the country, MONUSCO, which has been in the country for more than 2 decades now. And a disastrous humanitarian situations with record high numbers of internally displaced persons. And it is in this context that the Congolese population are going to elections in just a month's time. So I'm turning to you now, Alan, to answer the question that we decided for this webinar. What can we expect? And is the DRC a lost cause? The floor is yours. And you need to unmute yourself, Alan.
You may regret me asking me to do that, but anyway, just to thank you again, Nina, for inviting me for this webinar on the Egmont Institute, Royal Institute, and also to say how happy I am to join Ambassador Nijskens, who is, as you said, a former distinguished envoy to several countries where I also worked at various times, but also, most importantly, to the Great Lakes. I actually stepped down as the SRSG in the Congo a dozen years ago. And my departure actually coincided with the 50th anniversary of independence, and it was a major occasion. The King of Belgium was there, but this time around there was no acrimony, which had marred the independence celebrations 50 years before. Significantly, Presidents Museveni and Kagame from Uganda and Rwanda were also present. And it was the first time, possibly the last time, they all met together in Kinshasa. So it was a good occasion. The Secretary General was there, and there was a sense of a degree of optimism that perhaps, just perhaps, a corner might have been turned. But sadly, as we know now, that was not to be. And of course, within a year, just over a year, the violence had recommenced in the east, and M23 emerged, eventually taking over Goma before being expelled. And of course, if you look back now over the decade that's followed, while much of the Congo has been at peace and in incidents, but largely peaceful, that's not been the case in the east. And that's despite numerous interventions from the international community, from regional bodies, and from on a bilateral basis. Even before I left, I once counted the number of special envoys there were for the Congo, and we'd reached, I think, almost a dozen by the time I left. And sometimes I fear that we worked in different directions. But all of that attention hasn't brought lasting peace to the East, particularly. And today, I was just looking at the numbers, today the DRC has at least 5 million internally displaced people, more than any other country in Africa, despite all those interventions that the UN and others have made. Of course, of late, there's been some more positive news on the economic side. The IMF's claims that the economy is growing, but it cautions that's largely based on mineral exports. And then in its recent report, it cautioned, I want to quote this because I think it's really important. It sums up the issues before the country. The IMF wrote that, and I quote, reforms to strengthen the rule of law and the judiciary system, curb corruption, and improve transparency in the mining sector and public finances are critical to improve the business climate for private investment and economic diversification. That report could have been written 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And it's rather sad to see that the same issues keep coming back up. And one has to ask why. Other macroeconomic assessments, however, shade, I think, what is really extremely important, which is the deeper reality of mass poverty and low human development in the Congo. Again, let me quote the bank here, the World Bank, which says the DRC is among the 5 poorest nations in the world, and 1 out of 6 people living in extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa lives in the DRC. That's an enormous indictment, I must say, of Congolese successive Congolese administrations, but also perhaps of the international and regional organizations to perhaps come fully to grips with those problems. But it does, if you will, those figures or those numbers amply illustrate a sad adage about the Congo, which is it's a rich country full of very poor people. Of course, I don't blame all of the country's problems on the current or even recent administration. As we know, history casts a long shadow. We have to be mindful, dare I say, to this audience, of the doleful legacy of colonization. And of course, the impact of the Cold War, when major powers overlooked the transgressions of the Mobutu regime in exchange for strategic and commercial advantage. I was in Congo during that time. I was there in the late 80s when Mobutu was still in power. And I was at Nsele the day that he announced, to everybody's disbelief, that he was ending the monopoly of power of his personal political party and that there would be elections and so forth. I think a number of people in the audience didn't actually believe that that would happen, and it didn't really happen. There were elections, but we all know what happened, and the country was well on its way to collapse. But external forces then and now still have an important and largely adverse impact on the DRC. We know that much of the violence, and I'm probably repeating what was said earlier in the week, much of the violence in the East has been perpetrated by armed groups that originated in Rwanda and Uganda. Both countries have succeeded in pushing out those armed groups, only to find that they then install themselves, the LRA being the earlier one, of course, in the undergoverned spaces of the Eastern Congo, and continue their violence, and of course, to some extent, cross-border raids from the DRC. And regrettably, competition, I think, between Rwanda and Uganda for political primacy and pecuniary gain in the Eastern Congo continues to contribute to instability, which has, of course, been compounded, I believe, by the government's own failures of governance over many years. But I have to say, as former head of the UN peacekeeping operations in the Congo, I have to be aware and I have to recognize that the UN had its failures as well, and particularly in the area of civilian protection. We did not and have not done as well as we should have done for various reasons. Capacity is part of it, but also I think a mindset that really didn't come to grips early enough, and I put that at my own door, with the dimensions of the protection problem and how to go about trying to deal with it. And this has created understandable frustration among local communities that have rioted, demonstrated, attacked peacekeepers. That happened. I know there's been a spate of attacks lately in the last year or so, especially in North Kivu, but that was happening even when I was there. And to be very frank, part of that was orchestrated for political reasons by local military and commanders and local politicians. And it was a distraction to some extent from their own failures of governance. But nevertheless, UN has to accept its share of that blame and responsibility, and that includes me, I might add. And of course, of late, it's led to the demand from Kinshasa for an accelerated withdrawal of the peacekeepers. But I believe really that irrespective of whether the peacekeepers go or stay, it's the government's fundamental failure to push through key institutional and policy reforms, which, by the way, were promised in the 2013 Regional Security Framework, which was very explicit on a whole number of areas, both for the DRC, but also it called for the country's neighbors also to undertake certain commitments. But more recently in the joint DRC-UN transitional plan, which included a whole range of benchmarks that supposedly are to be completed before the mission withdraws. But the trouble is the mission has no control over those benchmarks. The same thing happened, I might add, in Afghanistan, where NATO and the international community set out benchmarks saying, if you reach those benchmarks, we will leave. But of course, they couldn't guarantee that they couldn't meet those. They couldn't guarantee that those benchmarks would be achieved, nor can we do the same in the Congo. And so sooner or later, that withdrawal will take place, and not all of those benchmarks, far from it, will be achieved. So is the Congo a lost cause? Is it forever dystopia, blighted by mass poverty and widespread violence? Personally, I don't believe that's inevitable. But if the country is to achieve a brighter future, change is unavoidable and urgent. And I think the upcoming presidential election is a critical inflection point. I didn't see your earlier, I wish I had, webinar on the election, so I may be repeating something that was said or contradicting it. But I do want to dwell on this because I think it is an important inflection point. As you know, the 2018 election was a fraud. A blatant fraud. The Catholic Church and other observers commented and stated that. Nevertheless, for whatever that's worth, in the name of stability, the result was largely accepted by regional bodies and major powers. Personally, I feel that was a mistake, but it was done. But the downside of that was that the incoming government lacked essential, in my view, legitimacy, genuine legitimacy, and indeed internal coherence, and soon became entangled in internal disputes and discord with a rotating cast of ministers and senior figures. But what's worrying me now is the Catholic and Protestant churches in the Congo, together with civil society organizations, are already warning and have been warning for several months that the credibility of the forthcoming election is also in danger. There are serious doubts, as you well know, and those who follow the Congo, about the impartiality and integrity of the National Electoral Commission. I'm not pointing the finger, but its record, especially the last time around, was not good. And indeed, the final arbiter of electoral issues, in a way, or disputes or confirmation of the election, which is the Constitutional Court. For its part, however, the political opposition in the DRC needs to present, I think, a coherent and plausible case for change, and above all, avoid the self-defeating fragmentation propelled by regional antagonisms and personal ambitions. As you all know, the DRC uses first past the post electoral system, and this usually makes it easier for incumbents to retain office, especially if there are multiple candidates on the ballot. Frankly, that's why President Kabila changed the electoral law before the 2013 election, was to guarantee his own re-election. So Congolese society is now calling for the various opposition contenders to develop a collaborative approach to ensure that voters have a viable choice. And I think we should underline that. A good government needs a good opposition. And when you don't have that, then we see that governments lose accountability and don't accept responsibility. So I hope the opposition and the multiple candidates will heed the call of civil society. But I think regional and international actors have to play their part too. And in the time remaining before the election, which is very short now, they should continue to forcefully impress on the Congolese government that the election must be truly free and fair, if not perfect, but free and fair largely. And if not, warn them of the consequences if that is not indeed the case. Above all, I think they must not this time round endorse a dubious result in the name of stability, because they won't get stability in that context. For its part, the UN and other organizations that provide support for elections should be careful and should not do so if there are clear signs that electoral malpractice is likely or underway. But again, irrespective of whoever wins the presidential election, the fundamental problems facing the Congo will not be solved quickly or easily. Reforms in the security and judicial sectors, which are absolutely indispensable, and of which we've talked since I was certainly the SRSG in the Congo, were promised in the past but have not been delivered. But they're still critically important for ensuring the safety of citizens and the security of the state. Electoral legitimacy, and I want to emphasize this point, electoral legitimacy is crucial. It's the starting, but it's not the concluding point for effective reform and governance. Equally essential, and again a point to underline, is the need for a well-articulated and integrated political security strategy to deal with the recurring violence in the East. Martial law is not the answer. We didn't have such a strategy when I was the SRSG, and I think we haven't really developed it since, although there has been an effort, I know, to have to move in that direction. But that strategy should be based on community engagement and conciliation with local actors, not decreed from Kinshasa, much less New York or Geneva. But it also has to, and again, a point to underline, address the vested interests, local and foreign, entrenched in the political economy of the Eastern Congo. That helps to drive conflict. And unless we deal with those incentives or disincentives to peace in a way, then I think conflict will continue in one fashion or another. Finally, let me add that over the last 60 years, as we all know, the people of the Congo have suffered through one crisis after another, and they deserve and merit a much better future than the past or the media's past. But more than that, I think a Congo at peace and in prosperity would be of huge benefit for Africa as a whole. Africa, I'm convinced, needs economic champions. And if you look at what's happened in East Asia, for example, over the last half century, a few countries have taken the lead, but that prosperity has rippled outwards and embraced and involved and engaged and made more prosperous a whole range of neighbors in the area. So, and I think, again, there are 3, 4, 5 countries in Africa, which the Congo is a critical one, which, if they get it right, will have a huge transformative effect on the rest of the continent. I think to sum up, the forthcoming election provides a fresh opportunity, but it's also a test for the DRC to reshape its future and to begin to unlock its vast potential at the heart of Africa. So let's hope, and I think pray, that the Congo's leaders, whatever their political affiliation, will grasp and not squander this opportunity. So thank you again for the invitation today.
Thank you so much, Alan, for that comprehensive overview of the situation in the DRC that also takes a look back on the historical causes of the current situation. I'm now going to hand over to Renier for about 10-15 minutes, and after that I'll open up for Q&A. So please make sure that you write a question in the chat, and I'll read it out loud to the 2 speakers afterwards.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you, Alan, for this very comprehensive view and thorough elements on it. I would like to pick up, first of all, on a couple of major lines that you were drawing. And the one that comes first is that the same issues keep coming back. And if we go for the root of this crisis that is looming, that is permanently looming over the years, over the decades, is, for example, the start of the Mobutu period. And what is interesting in these different leaders who succeeded each other is that their first years were marked by positive institutions, the willingness to do well, and then suddenly, after a couple of years, in the case of Mobutu, the whole thing changed completely. Instead of the interest of the people, it became his own interest. Instead of the glory and the greatness of Congo, it became his own glory. And the systematic destruction started to work. It started with the economy, the Zionization, and then the one-party abuses and the human rights abuses, and then the destruction of all the economy with the misery growing to the people. People were thinking at the time, I was young attaché in Kinshasa, economic attaché in '76. People were saying, now we have reached the abyss. And the people who were joking were saying, it's the abyss maybe, but we are on the side of it. We hope nobody jumps. And when I came back to Congo in 2000, I was reminding people of that joke at the time, and they said, yes, we've jumped, but we've seen that this is still not the bottom of it. It's sad, but it's unfortunately a statistical reality. If we go very quickly through the major points, after Mobutu, there was who ended up with another feature of the crisis, successive crises in Congo. It's the pendulum movement between a call for engagement from the international community and superb isolation under the excuse of sovereignty. That is something that we see permanently also as a pendulum there. And it helps the destruction, and it also keeps the people numb in those situations. So after Mobutu came Laurent Désiré Kabila, and again, the first months of Kabila were remarkable. He was a real revolutionary, started paying people, confiscated goods and so forth. But unfortunately, when I arrived in 2000, all the elements of the end of steam in the regime were there. And unfortunately, he was assassinated. But out of that renewal of leadership appeared from nowhere Joseph Kabila, who suddenly decided, under the motto of continuation of his father's revolution, to break again. And that created a momentum for the international community, because he was calling on everybody to help finally bring peace to Congo again. And the planets were aligning in a rare momentum. The Western partners who had been pushed away by Mr. Kabila's father were interested in trying to give this country a chance. The region woke up also, and that is a new element, which is today something that we need to keep in mind and keep on board with all the other partners. And that led to the Sun City discussions, and it led also to the new constitution and the reshaping of the country fundamentally. All the destroyed institutions were all looked through. It was an immense discussion among all who had pieces of power, had or wished to have. And with that refoundation of the Republic, it allowed, with the help of the United Nations and all the partners, to bring the 1+4 formula and get to internationally supervised elections. But as soon as these new situation was there, we unfortunately saw the recipe which was used by Mobutu and by Father Kabila, with the young Kabila, within the 2 years, started to lose interest, basically. As soon as he was confirmed as president, his major interest became then to win power, to bring in and steal, between brackets, or bribe all the interesting people who were coming from the Bemba and the Rubera side into his orbit. And within a couple of months, or let's say 1 year maximum, we had again a monolithic one-color power, with the others being largely puppets in this thing. And I want to come back to that because I think there is a pattern that needs to be broken if we want to see the Congo again as a hopeful conglomerate. The good thing in those years is that there was talk about balkanization, but all the people in the east and in the north of these rebellious areas had no interest at all to set up their own republic or state. Everywhere we went, the idea was, we want to go to Kinshasa, share the power, and bring the country back on its feet. Then Alan said he was there in 10. I think he saw already all the elements of the hardening of the position, the loss of interest by Kabila to have any interest in development, and the return to massive corruption, lack of security, and all the rest. Luckily, when he wanted the third term, 2018 was an extraordinary year of waking up by the civil society and the people of Congo. It is rare in a democratically conducted election to see people with various levels of education, but a lot of bon sens. They feel well, as with or without instruction. That was not a course that was good for them to keep. And the result of the election is therefore maybe a unique situation in Africa. Having 62%, the famous figure that nobody is allowed to mention in Congo, is so remarkable. And it was a result of a uniting of forces of the oppositions. That is another very rare element, which probably is going to be crucial in the election, in the upcoming election. And there is another point that I want to mention in the beginning of the Kabila period, is that both the leaders designing a new mechanism to stabilize Congo and the international community agreed to set up what was called in French, le CIAT, le Comité international d'accompagnement de la transition. That CIAT, I was by coincidence the ambassador there and participated in the CIAT, was instrumental to have a quick, immense impact at the beginning of a crisis. And it made it possible to diffuse crisis, which otherwise would have brought Congo back very quickly in a situation of Sudan. If there had been a CIAT in Sudan, in southern Sudan, there probably might have been not a similar situation going on there. And then today's situation is indeed pointing to maybe a lost situation if a couple of elements are not taken into account. One, there is a general state capture. We've learned the word in South Africa. Today's Congo is ruled by state capturers. And what nobody knows, or what nobody feels enough, is that when it reaches that stage, the newcomers with good intentions are convinced and convinced that they will be able to change the system, in fact, are gobbled up by the system. It is so powerful that there is virtually no chance within that system for reformists to come up. What we see since the beginning of the Tshisekedi presidency is a very example that confirms this kind of unfortunate permanent rule in this case. I could go on, Nina, for 1 or 2 more minutes, but I want to give the floor to many people. There are a couple of points that the first past the post is a disaster. Oh, yes, maybe to make sure that Congo is not a lost case. I think the opposition today needs to really do the same effort as in September 2018. These are strong egos. Each of them is, of course, convinced that he will win the election. There is no chance that any of those, be it popular, be it clever, be it whatever, have a single bit of chance to win that election under these circumstances. And therefore, if they have no patriotic feeling in overcoming their approaches, and if they don't succeed in working out a common ticket, a situation whereby each of them agrees to take a role in a future election, and then they withdraw and help each other, which, by the way, was the real reason why Fayulu got success. Maybe Fayulu thinks that it was his dancing and his appeal and so forth that made it. No, he got the 62% because it was a combination of active support by all the political opposition forces. Let me stop at this, and I'll be happy to come back at some other points, because I hate webinars where one, and Alan gave the example by being very sharp and given opportunities to questions.
So thank you to both speakers for being brief and giving us the opportunity to have a real discussion with questions. And I think there are a few points that both of you brought out that deserves more discussion. One is, of course, that we're seeing history repeat itself in many ways. We see many similar patterns. We've seen the regional intervention in the East. We've also seen, as Renier was just mentioning, a state capture by actors who are not really willing to let go of power. And as Alan was mentioning, that the international community has not always played as an important role as they would have liked to do, while often being blamed as scapegoats for internal failures. So we have these things coming up again and again, and this is, of course, something that I would like to ask you questions about. And I'll have a few questions, first from the chat, but also a few of my own. So from Anya Palm, we have a question, what to expect of the next 6 months amidst the elections, not only the presidential elections, but also provincials, and for the first time, communal elections. And MONUSCO is to thin out. We know that the president has now asked MONUSCO to withdraw. It's set to withdraw very soon. This has been something I used to work on the DRC in the beginning of the 2007, 2008, and that was already a call for that at the time, MONUC to withdraw. But now we have a real movement for the UN to withdraw. So what will the UN's role be? Is there a role for the UN to play in the DRC after this, and what should it be? And that question goes for both of you. There's also the question about the EAC withdrawal, the East African Regional Force that's set to withdraw on the 8th of December, I think, and a possible deployment of the SADC, the SADC, the Southern African Development Community. So we see that there is quite a multiplication of different regional forces that are about or have been deployed to the DRC. What does that set the regional scene to be? And are they actually going to solve the problem, or are they going to make it more difficult for the situation and the context in the DRC? I'm going to give the word first to Alain for answering these questions, and then I'll move over to Renier, and then we have quite a few other questions. So Alain, the floor is yours. Your microphone is muted.
Thanks. Just one or two quick comments in response to Renier, because he made an excellent, made a number of very important points, particularly the importance of state capture and how we keep running into the same problem. Every new administration starts off quite well, but then quickly backs off. It's what I call the regimes, when they come in, acquire a sense of want to assert their sovereignty. Sometimes it's for very good, positive reasons. Other times it's for less positive reasons, and wanting to consolidate power and get hold of the resources. And I was very concerned about that when I was there. And I'd suggested to President Kabila that we resurrect, or then completely fold it, but resurrect SEAT as a way of pulling support for him in and the program that he had announced. But I quickly saw he had no interest in that whatsoever. He wanted to escape the tutelage of SEAT, and was no way that he was ever going to have this. He didn't want any controls whatsoever. And so he discouraged every effort in any sector to ensure donor coordination. I tried the same with the endorsement of the Security Council, interesting enough. They put it in our mandate to coordinate on security sector reform. But there was no way that was going to happen. He just did not want to have any sort of emprise from behind. So it's a good point. The other point quickly is, because I think this is again a great danger if things continue to stagnate or worse, and that is the prospect of balkanization. Katanga shouldn't be forgotten after all. And while I don't think that's going to happen, nevertheless, with predatory neighbors, you never know what can happen. And the Congo has 9-10 neighbors. So I worry a little bit about that this is something that must be carefully considered, particularly if certain parts of the country become increasingly restless with control, or perhaps from Kinshasa. So on to the points that Anya made about the next 6 months and the elections. I haven't talked about it all but it's important about the second order elections, for provincial and other posts. That is important because I don't know. Again, when I was in the Congo, there was this effort that started to reduce the size of the provinces, but it was not being done, I think, for the best of reasons. It was particularly being done, I think, especially to avert or avoid any regional power bases developing that could be used against the central power. It was always a concern about Katanga, of course, and Moise Katumbi. Moise was become a very popular governor, and it was clear that Kinshasa was very uncomfortable with that and the power in Katanga, but one or two of the other more wealthier provinces. So I have a feeling, sadly, that much of that, though, will also be subject to patronage and deals, and I don't know to what extent we will see emerging younger, more qualified, and more committed level of leadership at the lower levels. But again, I haven't followed this in any great depth in the last years or so. The withdrawal of MONUC, again, I don't know. Let's see. If President Tshisekedi is re-elected, I suspect that the pressure to remove MONUSCO will perhaps diminish somewhat. Personally, though, I believe MONUSCO should be withdrawing. I'm convinced of that. I've written about that. We have become a default option for when things go wrong. And, you know, protection at the end of the day cannot be subcontracted. MONUSCO, like the other missions, can never work like Wagner. And I think sometimes, both in the Congo and elsewhere, there's been a tendency to see UN peacekeeping missions, and this goes back to the days of Lumumba, by the way, and his quarrels with Hammarskjöld and Ralph Bunche, as some sort of auxiliaries. And you know, I think the UN is caught a little bit now in that trap. When anything goes wrong, well, where's the UN? Why hasn't the UN done it? I'm not saying there aren't failings. I'm the first to admit that, but it's not helping the country. A country has to protect its own people, and you cannot protect people from their own government and the abuses of their security services. So I personally believe in an organized fashion, we should avoid the Mali shambles. We need to think about now the future and place responsibility, because what happens otherwise is you have accountability, you have responsibility without authority. And that's not a good place to be. And I think that's what's increasingly happened. So the role of the UN, I think, will have to change. It should go back to more traditional responsibilities, perhaps still not keep a peacekeeping force, but be prepared to support, as we've done in places like Colombia and in Nepal, have non-armed peace support staff who can work on things like security reform and so forth. And then finally it's very interesting that the EAC has barely got its feet on the ground or boots on the ground, and it's out. I think the same thing will happen with the SADC force, because the basic problem remains unaddressed, which is national security forces are incapable or unwilling or unable to provide the kind of protection for civilians that is their responsibility. And no external force, however long it remains, and however big it is, can do that. It's not, again, a strict comparison, but we've seen what happened in Afghanistan, where the resources were infinitely greater than anything that MONUC or MONUSCO will have.
Thank you for that exhaustive and quite frank answer to the future of the UN. That's refreshing to hear. Renier, would you like to address some of the questions mentioned before I go for another round of questions?
Yes, thank you. Very briefly, just I cannot agree more with Alan than that the root cause, the first approach, the key possible solution lies in Kinshasa. If and when the Kinshasa authorities are going to decide, one, to reform the army, kick out the old generals who are under all kinds of things and who are businessmen and who demotivate the younger. Second, are bringing order in the whole mining sector and end this scandalous social drama where you have creuseurs, poor people who have to go and work and in the evening deliver a couple of bags of minerals to their anonymous bosses and then go through informal circuits. As long as these root causes will not be addressed, including with the communities, but on the Congolese side, what this will further be attracting bees and looters from elsewhere and stimulate the possible balkanization. So it's very painful to see that year after year, It started already, as far as I'm concerned, with Joseph Kabila, when the international community and the UN, we were all there to help at the DDR and the DDRRR and train new serious battalions to bring order in it. The first action by the authorities was to tell us all, the partners, okay, do what you want and do it. But as soon as the money was there and the programs were there and they were completed, the thing was closed down and everything started again. And the well-trained, best-trained military, be it by the South Africans, by the French, by us, by the Belgians, and so forth, they were just put outside the possibility of making a strong base for the army to take up its responsibilities. So that's what I wanted to add to in detail to what Alan said.
Right. Both of you have mentioned briefly the role of the regional actors. We have more questions on that. So, Alan, you said that the East African forces basically only touched ground before it was asked to leave again, and that the problem is from within. And then we have the possibility of a deployment of the SADC coming, but you're also saying that there is a big likelihood that it will meet the same fate as long as the internal security forces are not capable of protecting its own population, then any external force won't be able to do so. So these are several questions in one. Is there any way that regional actors could play a more positive role in the solution of crisis? Is there any type of deployment mediation role that either the EAC or the SADC could play in the current situation? So that's one question. I also have a question from my colleague, Eric Kennis, who hosted our webinar last week, also reminding those who didn't see that you can see it on YouTube, webinar on the DRC and CENI. So his question is that a few institutions in the DRC work as they should, according to the constitution, but there are persistent rumors that at least some of the presidential advisors think about changing the constitution. Do you think that a change in constitution could be a positive contribution and could improve the situation, provided that the change is realistic and based on a broad consensus? And then a final question. I know I'm making you work for your money here, but one more question is that with all of the negative evaluations of MONUC-MONUSCO, I know that at some point it was called a mission with the impossible mandate. So we should also make sure that we put the expectations where they should be. But there have been quite a few negative evaluations over the years. If we had done something differently, if the mission should have done something differently over the past 25 years, what should we have done differently? When I say we, I'm now speaking as the international community behind the UN mission. So, Alain, would you like to go first on these questions? Please unmute your microphone.
Yeah, well, please feel free to interrupt me because I tend to drone on a bit, you know. But on the first thing about can regional actors play a useful role, I believe that. I mean, I had a lot of experience in West Africa, particularly in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Cote d'Ivoire, and they did play, particularly in Liberia and Sierra Leone. Also Cote d'Ivoire. They played a very strong and constructive role, but it came at the end of many years of disappointments, I have to say. And it was part of a configuration. It had strong regional leaders like Olusegun Obasanjo, who was really, I think, made a huge difference. And also, so there was a willingness to support through ECOWAS in particular, which was very active and which had, by the way, Mohamed Chambas, who was the executive secretary at the time, who was first class. So they played a role and they worked very closely with us, I must say. I have nothing but praise for the regional actors there at that time, and it made a big difference. But it took time, and it took patience and persistence, and peace agreements didn't come quickly. You know, Liberia went through something like 8 or 10 different peace agreements, all of which failed until there was the comprehensive peace agreement. And it's very important, and one of the great lessons of that was regional actors working with and through the Security Council. So there wasn't the kinds of divisions we've seen. Perhaps today, in today's world, it will be not quite so easy to get that kind of consensus. So yeah, the regional actors can have a role. But if those regional actors are indeed, how can I put it, work towards the end, the Congo's well-being, and not their own, you know, because neighbors don't always have the same interests, as we know. So, I mean, quite frankly, let's be frank, we all know this. Rwanda and Uganda have to be part of the solution, but too often they've been part of the problem. And I think this is really critical. I mean, we don't have, I don't think, the same level of problem with some of the other frontiers, Congo Brazza, Mozambique, and Tanzania and so forth. So I think that's really critical. And that is not, despite many efforts, including by external actors, the EU, the United States, Britain, my own country, have not been able to get that together. And that is critical. That's where the regional dimension would make a big difference. The Great Lakes Conference, I attended some of the conferences, and quite frankly, it didn't get us very far forward. So yes, role for the regional, providing it's a positive role and a constructive role, and it's done in symbiosis with of course, the leadership of the Congo. And the leadership of the Congo also recognizes the need to get that support. New constitution. Well, again, I noticed, was it Kenneth who raised this? He did said, provided. That's the catch, provided. And what followed his provision of provided, which is, you know, that it's consultative, it's inclusive, it's based on an open sense of participation and not hijacked by one group as opposed to another. And then, yes, look at the experience. No constitution, except perhaps the United States, and even that one is strained at times, is inviolable, is written in stone. But I think one has to be careful, because tinkering around the edges won't make a difference, I don't think. And above all, is there respect for the Constitution? Constitutions depend on people. I mean, as Barack Obama, I don't know if you remember this, but when he went in his first trip as president to Africa, he went to Ghana, and he spoke about not just having strong men, but strong institutions. But the reality is you need both. You need strong men and women to make strong institutions. Constitution is no more than that. So I think that's would be my hesitation on that level. Negative evaluations of UN MONUSCO, yeah, I mean, some of that is deserved. I think, as I said, though, we've become a little bit the default option for everything that goes wrong. I mean, I found this it was a bit irritating. I'll tell you, on times when something would happen. I still remember very clearly when the LRA was attacked up in Wele, as it was at the time, where they were camped out in the Karanja. And they were attacked by the Ugandan Air Force and Special Forces in conjunction with the Congolese, but at the FARDC, but at a distance, but with the encouragement of the United States. And it all went badly wrong. And the LRA dispersed and started moving west, heading for Central African Republic, South Sudan, and so forth, but left a terrible, terrible mess in its wake, a lot of atrocities. And believe it or not, within a day or two, there were questions being raised and claims being stated by some otherwise very responsible organizations. Where was MONUC? This is at a time when we had a full upscale rising of the CNDP in North Kivu, plus other things in the south. So, you know, there was a lack of realism as to what we could actually achieve. And I wrote subsequently, when I left the UN, a piece called Great Expectations, because expectations far exceeded capacities. You know, they talk about protection. At the height of our presence in the Kivus, we had, I think, about 11,000 soldiers, some of whom, of course, were logistics support. covering a region which is, immense, the size of California, but with no roads or anything else. And a certain head of state in Europe, based in Paris at the time, said, no, MONUC doesn't need any further reinforcement. They have enough people. They just don't do their job. When I read that, I checked what was the Paris police force. At the time, it was something like 30,000. And we had a third of that for the size of the Kivus. So I think this gulf between expectations and reality is something that UN mandates don't probably address. They throw everything into those mandates. They're like Christmas trees. And as a result, disappointment follows.
Thank you. I think you're right about the UN mandates and the expectations. We've seen the same in many of the different states in the Africa, most recently with MINUSMA in Mali, with high expectations and limited capacities, and also with limited consent from the host state. It's difficult to achieve the mandates. Renier, would you like to come in on the questions?
Thank you. I'll just go into two elements, not the UN. I leave that to the expert. Regarding the regional role, I was extremely thrilled and encouraged when I was appointed Special Envoy and meeting the heads of states in the region to discover how committed they were to, for their good reasons of themselves, to avoid a spillover of refugees and destabilization and all these things. And that welcome and the desire of these countries to be engaged was equally strong and serious from Uganda, Rwanda, Angola, Congo, Brazzaville, and South Africa. These were the ones whom I continuously and consistently saw as very eager to be part of helping to avoid a crisis to go sour, as people were fearing, I think rightly, if Kabila was staying on. However, in the course of the evolution, and Alan was pointing to that, there were local interests which from these countries, which started maybe in the very last minute to prevail. And for example, in the role of the whole region on Saturday, the 19th of January, when there was a threat by the region to really say, now you respect the real results, or you, and so on. What happened in that night was very weird. You had a plan of several heads of states to go to Kinshasa, and that plan was very quickly blocked by Kabila, who said, no open space, you don't come. And then there was a flurry of consultations among the heads of states. What are we going to do? And a very proactive, positive role was played by Faki, the boss of the African Union, the Angolan foreign minister, and the Rwandan presidency as well. And then suddenly at 11:30 at night, on the Saturday night, became the word, mission aborted, none of us will go. And then the rest is history. The Tshisekedi was declared winner, and so forth. I had spoken to these different presidents by coincidence, 4 days. I was in the region, so I was in constant contact with them. And I had sensed that there was a split starting already in the last days, although they were in the same line. And that was about the secret deal. And the secret deal, we know meanwhile that there was a kind of a guarantee by South Africa, by Egypt, and by Kenya, that South African position was clearly wavering, because the president, his diplomatic advisor had told me in the room waiting for seeing the president has no time to go to that initiative. Then when I saw the president, I spoke to him and I said, Mr. President, I know you don't like to interfere in domestic affairs, but I think the situation in Congo today calls for not indifference, because he was saying no interference. And I said, had the rest of the world answered no interference when you were under apartheid, I think you would not have liked it. And I call on you to do that. And then he ended by saying, okay, I'll see whether my agenda can be changed. Of course, we know again also the history, he didn't have to go there. But the Angolans, the Congolese, the African Union remain very, very committed to that. So just to give a couple of hints of when local and regional personal interests of the countries are there, Angola was and is very eager to have a functioning country there. They want to develop trade, they want to avoid outflows, they want to have good relations with their, and they saw that there was a big risk in refusing to have the truth of the ballot implemented. Regarding the change of constitution, I think sorry for my good friend Eric Kennis, I think it's a risky thing. The constitution in the Congolese constitution is, as it was finalized in Sun City, was a remarkable piece, very balanced, good division of powers between the presidency and the government. And it has been tampered with by Kabila as soon as he could to gain all the powers on him. And the one who was complice to that was then Prime Minister Muzito, who gave in to a request by Némi Mwilanya that from now on, all decisions regarding finances and contracts should be receiving a visa by the presidency. So Congo today has an unconstitutional situation whereby the powers of the president are too heavy by that. A second thing that Kabila has destroyed as quickly as he could was the first past the post instead of the second. In such a diverse country, having a situation where you can be elected with 8%, provided you have enough Charlies who go into their so-called hopeful presidential election, you have a non-consensual president. The other fact is the working provinces. Today, of course, Alan was mentioning the risk that if a province is too powerful, there is a risk of balkanization. But today's multiplication of provinces has made it that all the budget go for self-supporting, and there is zero left for any action effect and trickling down to the people in those places. There should be, instead of a reform of constitution, the setting up, with the help of international community, of a very strong anti-corruption unit with powers and with means technical and financial, independently, but also with powers like judicial powers and policing powers. There were two good examples in Africa. Why not to take a leaf from there? The famous Scorpios in South Africa before Mr. Zuma tried to give them a little bit of a lighter version. And in Kenya, at the end of the Arap Moi period, where John Githongo was the responsible person for that anti-corruption unit. And that these two models exist there. To all calls to the current regime for setting up this kind of thing have been unanswered. But that could be enough. The transparency of the government is so essential. As long as you have backroom deals possible, all kinds of weird pressures and people visiting you with a sombrero up to the nose in the evening and telling you that your business is going to be worth nothing tomorrow if you don't give your shares or hand over the keys to this member of the presidential family, there will be no hope for prosperity and for massive A+ investors. You will only have weird investors who are pleased with that. And finally, part of the governance is end the impunity. Impunity should be jailing people if they are really bad people, and second, reimburse stolen monies. We've been hearing about the billions of Mobutu, we've been hearing of the billions, even more, of Kabila. Nobody is interested, but that could make a huge difference if tomorrow there would be also something onto that. And maybe one of the practical things would be that instead of every candidate declaring at the beginning of the, now the election campaign, his patrimony, what he owes, and not putting it in an envelope that is given to the very good constitutional court, which might have it disappearing over time, but to publish it. And at every election, have a publication again of the patrimony of each of the politicians who hold it. I'll leave it at that.
Mm.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for these interesting answers and your comments and also your ideas about how to change the situation. It's also really interesting for us as participants and audience to hear from the personal experiences that you've had, because that also gives all of this a bit more of a realistic discussion. We have more questions from the audience. One is referring to a structural dynamic in the DRC. The speakers mentioned the pattern where the leaders, after a promising start, fall back into the same problem. Is there any theories what, who, or how this is caused or triggers that transition from the promising start and then going into some sort of more keeping in power, corruption, and so on? Are the leaders blackmailed? Are they getting greedy? Are they giving in? Or are they just giving up? And I think that question is something that can be copied to many other parts of the world, but today we're only going to focus on the DRC, and I would like to hear your thoughts on that. And then another question about the UN mission. Soldiers of the Force Intervention Brigade that Lucas Steinbach is asking the question that I talked to are increasingly dissatisfied and annoyed at the structural problems of MONUSCO. They reported they do have an offensive mandate, but they're not allowed to engage, don't get the commands to follow up on armed groups, but are left counting the dead after attacks. Do you think that changing the UN mandate is a feasible alternative to withdrawing it as a whole in order to make the UN mission more effective and actually help the country stabilizing the eastern provinces? Again, that's a question that can be addressed to basically all of the, almost all of the situations where the UN is today in Africa. Should they have a more offensive mandate, almost a counter terrorist mandate or a counter insurgency mandate, or are we then going back onto the holy principles of the UN where we are asking for a limited use of force? So that question is more for Alain, I think. And then a final question, and I'll stop for this round. This is an anonymous attendee who is saying that it's clear that the next election will be catastrophical. There is no one who thinks that they will be credible. So what type of engagement can the international community do in this situation where the odds of irregular or a fraudulent election are very high? Would you like to start, Alain, to keep the order? Please turn on the microphone. Now you're muted. I think you were on, your microphone was on earlier.
I'll get this right one of these days. Well, very good questions, and I'm tempted to say let Renier answer them all. I can comment, but why do leaders fall back? I mean, you pointed that out, and it's not only, of course, in the Congo. Part of it, I think, is what I call the seduction of sovereignty. You know, that you've even very good leaders, when after a year or two, your influence declines, and that's the way it should be. You know, they feel it's their country, they won, particularly if there's been a credible election. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. We have to vest responsibility where it belongs, providing an accountability with that. But sadly, yes, there are cases where, too many cases where leaders are not just in Africa. Power, you know, an absolute power we all know corrupt. And so putting in place safeguards, free press, for example, I think a very active civil society is also extremely important. We've seen that to a degree in the Congo, and I certainly saw it in West Africa. It does make a difference, including, by the way, from West Africa, women's groups. I found it can often be really powerful, very influential, and should be encouraged. But that tendency is there. It's there in our own countries, in Western Europe and, dare I say it, North America. It is part of the, sadly, human behavior. So it's putting guardrails, setting norms that then come to be accepted and enshrined. And that takes time, and it takes persistence. And to be frank, too, leaders, especially those that are from fragile countries trying to grapple their way back, will have to make compromises. Not every compromise is corrupt or illegal, but equally well, and we know that, I don't know if the OECD guidelines, or not guidelines, norms now about corruption have had an impact, but we have been part of the problem. I mean, Mobutu always used to say that to visiting when issues of corruption were raised. He would very disingenuously, admittedly, say to them, well, and who taught us about corruption? Corruption involves two. And, everyone back off and say, oh, well, So I think we have to be honest also that our business communities and others and governments have used the same. We shouldn't be too holier than that. But I do agree we need to keep after it, persistence, and encourage those who will do something, like the anti-corruption commissions that Renier mentioned, if we can get them up and keep them running, because sometimes they ruffle feathers or worse. In terms of UN missions, yes, and the Force Intervention Brigade, and was it kept under on a short leash, so to speak? I mean, you alluded to that, Nina. I mean, it's the classic problem. Countries expect Wagner and they get the UN. I'm sorry, it sounds a bit flippant, but I mean, I've been in these situations and where they really expect the UN to act as their surrogates, to go out and do things which they can't or won't do themselves. So I don't think we should mix up the two. UN doesn't do peace enforcement. We're not good. Missions are not fielded, and I saw this very much in Eastern Congo with our own forces, and good units, like the South Africans, for example. They're not set up as expeditionary forces. They don't have the equipment. They don't have the resupply chains. They don't have the command and control. And you can't do that. Even in, and then of course you have national caveats, which really have to be negotiated and navigated. We've seen that in the operations in the Balkans, for example. We've seen it in Afghanistan with NATO forces. If you put together a multilateral force, there are going to be limits. There are going to be constraints, probably more so in a UN mission. The one advantage, great irreplaceable advantage, is legitimacy there. They're there at the request of, nominally, but above all with the endorsement of the world. Once that legitimacy starts to erode for whatever reason, then it really is time to think about going home. But putting in short-term defensive operations are possible, but longer-term anti-terrorism operations, that's a whole different ball game. And even, as I say, the most experienced, equipped forces like we saw in Afghanistan have not really succeeded. So we should be very careful before we sort of rush into these things, but let's make it clear in the mandates that is not their job, if you will, because otherwise there are disappointments. How, if in the next elections we don't get a credible election, what to do about it? That's an extremely good question. I wish I had a facile answer. We'll have to see what comes out, to what extent is there credibility. It won't be perfect, but at least if there is a sense of that, by and large, it's accepted first and foremost by the people of the Congo. If they accept that, okay, not brilliant, but it's okay, then I think we can build on that. But if it's not that, then I think I wouldn't say all bets are off, but then we will need to rethink how the international community, including the UN, then engages with that regime or whatever it is that comes into place.
Right. Thank you for that. You evoked the questions, the eternal question about what role the UN should play, and you've already kind of given an answer in saying that the UN should not try to do this peace enforcement missions that have been asked by it, and that the expectation should also not be put on it to provide services like the Wagner Group is providing. So perhaps lower the expectations and have more realistic and shorter term mandates where the capacities and capabilities are up to the test are the solution to that problem. Renier, would you like to come in and answer the questions as well?
Yes, thank you. I'm not, again, touching the UN expertise, so which I endorse fully. But I want to add on to answer on the two other points. One is what about the people who start, new leaders who start, what should be the reaction of the international community, the partners, to avoid fallback after a promising start. Then, when I was ambassador in Kinshasa in 2000, with the first days and weeks and months and years of Kabila, Joseph Kabila, I was calling for early reaction to the signs when things were bizarre or started with rumors. And the first thing was saying, this is a bad signal. We should not let it go, because there is no reason why such a signal appears. And unfortunately, the majority of the partners who were present in Kinshasa at the time were saying, look, no, hold it. We just come out of a very tense set of years. This is a young power, give him a chance. So one, we should not confuse giving a chance with starting corruption or wrong path. There was a particularly painful element with the international financial institutions, which were called in to re-engage with Congo, with finance in tatters. And I spoke very much with those delegates from first of all, the World Bank and then the IMF who were coming. There were two delegates, each one of the IMF and one of the International Monetary Fund based in Kinshasa, so we could have an interaction regularly with them. And I said, what was very painful to me in my previous years in other African countries was to see the delegations coming for a review or preparing a disbursement of huge credits that they were doing that despite very serious flaws in governance, and saying, are you sure that the money that you're providing is going to go to that one and that there is enough sustainability to it? And the answer was very blunt by sometimes, and it's painful to say, said, look, there is such an urge by the board in Washington to tell all our members that we are actively supporting and so forth, that we cannot in this mission be too picky, too choosy, and too tough. And then I said, at least at the end, when the communique at the end of your visit is there, be clear and say, instead of what I called communique number one, we made the review, we saw a little technical weaknesses, but we are trusted the government to do that. And in fact, they had received from us information about a huge corrupt deal, which was worth tens of millions of dollars by the young Kabila, and the communique number one came out. So I said to them the day after, congratulations. I'm sure that the next communique, the next time the visit comes, it's not going to be a couple of tens of millions, it's going to be a couple of 100 millions. And by the time the IMF broke with Kabila because of the Chinese contracts secrecy, he was already in the billions of dollars. So early reaction and no response to pressure to disperse. Regarding the engagement about of the international community for the election, I think first of all, the international community has a tool which is the electoral missions, observers missions. And I'm very happy that the European Union made the decision to go, and I'm very happy to see that they are very knowledgeable people who will be in that mission. But the second point will be to to be sure that when, let me start it differently. We have to expose daily that what is happening in Congo today, the way the process is going, is not a fatality. As from the beginning of this new regime, all kinds of non-urgency elements were done. There was a call for organizing a census. No, that's not useful. Okay, no, we have other urgencies. And then call to start early with the CENI appointment of very fine people. By the way, Mr. Kadima, who is currently the boss of the CENI, had a perfect record as a brilliant and very integer person, as the manager director of the Electoral Institute of Southern Africa. I worked with him when I was in my South African period there. But here he has a couple of bizarre, bad elements attached to him. First of all, he is appointed while it's not in the way he should have been appointed. Second, he is from the same tribe of the president. And with the tribalization of politics under this regime, it creates suspicions to others. And third, with the expertise he has, why has he been keeping quiet when he, in charge of making good elections, should have been heard regularly and loud to expose or call on the government to do things if it was there? And finally, is it dangerous to go for a botched election when you see that Mr. Nanga and all the others who had been crooking the treasury and who had been throwing out tens of thousands of uncounted ballots can not only remain free, but can also, again, be candidate for all kinds of elected posts? That is a symptom of a very sick situation of institutions and politicians.
Yes, thank you for very candid answers again, and for personal experiences.
You said, Nina, that there was no Chatham House rules, so I'm sorry, I said what I think.
Well, we can definitely say that this is a frank and open webinar where we're tackling quite a huge number of difficult questions. And time is closing very quickly. This means it's been an interesting discussion. I'm going to still ask two more questions, and I'm going to ask you to be very short in your answers to them, as you've been previously, so that we can end the webinar in time. At some point, one of you mentioned rumors and how they affect the situation, and that brings me to more of a buzzword today, not just in DRC, but across the globe: disinformation. And when you speak to people in the DRC today, that's one of the main worries about the coming elections, but not just elections, the situation more broadly. How can we tackle the disinformation that's affecting both the security context, but also the political context today? And in what way is disinformation affecting them? If you could think a little bit about that in your last answers. And I should also recommend that there is a great article on disinformation in Africa in Le Grand Continent in French, written by Guillaume Sotomayor and co-authors. And a last question then, and coming back to the elections, as we are very close to the elections in the DRC, we talked a little bit about CENI and how it perhaps has not played the role that it has been expected to play. So a question from Ivan Godefroid, who's listening in, is also, if there are so many doubts on this CENI's credibility and legitimacy, what's the point then of having a common ticket for the opposition? What difference would that make, especially when we have the last elections fresh in memory? So I'm going to end the questions with this, and I would ask you to be quite brief in your answers, and I'll give the floor to Alan. Alan, your mic is muted.
Yeah, social media platforms and disinformation are a very real problem. And particularly, you know, the interesting thing about what's happened in the Congo and other African countries is how portable phones and so forth have become ubiquitous, which is great, which is good, I think. But on the other hand, of course, it makes you much more vulnerable then to the rapid movement of unfounded of rumors and so forth, which we've seen. So I think that needs very careful attention. And my former organization, the Kofi Annan Foundation, spent a lot of time and effort on this and created a commission. Mr. Annan created that not long before he passed away, because he was precisely desperately worried about the impact of social media on African society and particularly on politics in Africa. And he cautioned, the report cautioned, you can find it on their website, about the dangers. And we've just done a program on this in Nigeria, where it's again a great problem. And so you need to put some guardrails in. And ideally that should be done by the CENI, but we'll see if that has actually happened or not. Second, well, what's the point of this? If the CENI is going to kind of queer the pitch, as we say well, you know, that happened the last time, but nevertheless, the opposition did win a plurality of votes, and what happened afterwards is different, but I still think it's worth doing and making sure that those votes are counted, tabulated. I think there'll be a lot more pressure this time because of seeing what happened the last time. I don't think people will accept it quite so easily, and that's dangerous, I admit, but I think that's really important. No, we should not give up. And I think more eyes, more interventions, particularly from the region on the CENI, hopefully will have some impact and try to ensure that the result is a reasonable resemblance to what actually has been voted for.
Thank you for being very brief. Renier, last few words before I conclude.
Yes, thank you. Regarding the rumors and the disinformation, I would just add to what Alan was saying, that probably we have to be on board of this new technique, which is more than communication. It's influencing, and it can have sometimes even strategic or deep political consequences. And therefore, it becomes a tool of diplomacy. It becomes a tool of partnership, and we should not let it as partners to just the moods and the pushes and the hidden forces behind. In the Cold War, there were special radios organized to reach people beyond the propaganda of regimes. Maybe here we should think about something that is more adapted to the way so as to bring people something which is true, and or be able to counter fake news. That's regarding the rumors. And regarding the common ticket approach, well, you have two ways. One, to say, like President Tshisekedi, I'm going to win this election anyhow, so I don't care how the opposition goes, thinking maybe if I have even few percent, they will share even less percentage, and therefore I'll win on a brilliant carpet. The ticket formula could be an innovation whereby, first of all, the different posts, which these, let's see, three major contenders are hoping to catch, would be made in equal weight, because the egos are such that none of the major three would accept to become subdued to the other, to the winner of that. So if you divide again the presidency powers with the prime minister powers, as in the constitution, we restore that, you become if you are prime minister, you have the weight of running the country and so forth. And the president has more of a ceremonial role or general ideas. And then there are other options. For example, if there is a third candidate who has a certain stature and who has a view, who has not been in the system, and who would then maybe head a special commission of a council of reforms. That has been set up, by the way. It was intended like that. When Kabila saw no way of keeping the excessive time that he was having, and that then there was this special position designed for Mr. Tshisekedi's father. Unfortunately, he passed away, and then there was somebody who was not up to the task to do that. But he could have had a position, a bit like in Iran, you have Ayatollah Khomeini, who is not the president, he's not the prime minister, but he has a position which gives him, for his ego, and also, if he has something serious to do, reforms. There is a reform for 10 of these people to go. So ticket is worth it, and the people who will vote for the one person or that other, they vote for the three together, if it is three or whoever it will be.
Thank you for coming up with new ideas at the end of this webinar, which I think have provided interesting questions and answers to very complicated topics that the DRC is tackling with now, but as we've heard, has been tackling with for decades. What has come out of this webinar is so many things that I'm not going to try to resume it here, but we know that we need to fight impunity, that there is need to reform the security sector and the judicial sector to go forward, to avoid that leaders become seduced by sovereignty, and also that external actors are not going to be able to replace local actors in protecting the population. So expectations should be lowered, and mandates should be more realistic for the different international missions that are in the DRC. And for the forthcoming elections, we also know that there is considerable problems that are coming up, but that there is also a strong local civil society that are trying to make these elections as fair and free as possible. So I would like to thank the two speakers for their brilliant discussion and bringing out experiences from their personal experience in the region and in the DRC more particular. I think that has made this webinar one of a kind. You can go back into our Egmont Institute's YouTube channel to watch it if you missed it, or if you want to share it with somebody else. And you can also sign up on our website, Egmont Institute, for upcoming webinars and also see all of our publications. I should say that Eric Kennis, my colleague, has published on the DRC on our website, and so as together we've also written a few policy briefs on the situation. So please stay with us in the coming weeks and follow what's happening in the DRC, but more broadly on the African continent. Thank you very much, Alain Dos, for being with us. Thank you also, Renier Nijskens, for being with us today.